Let's do a different kind of video. For months, I covered the dark side of Latin America's internet country by country, case by case. But there are stories that don't need a screen to be disturbing. Today I'm bringing together the darkest cases I've covered in the region, and I'm adding some that have never appeared on the channel before. Real cases, real countries. You already know how this goes. Welcome to the dark side of Latin America. On August 9th, 2023, Fernando Villavicencio finished his speech at the Sports Coliseum of Colegio Mejia in the north of Quito. It was 7 in the evening. There were more than 2,000 people. Applause. As he came down from the stage and walked toward the parking lot, an 18-year-old Colombian hitman approached him and shot him in the head. Villavicencio fell on the spot. His bodyguards gunned down the shooter. 7 Colombian accomplices who were waiting nearby fled. Fernando Villavicencio arrived at the hospital with no vital signs. There were 11 days left until Ecuador's presidential elections. To understand why this crime was so devastating for Ecuador, and why it still has no complete answer 2 years later, you have to understand who Fernando Villavicencio was. He was born in 1963 in the canton of Sacasili, in the province of Cotopaxi, in Ecuador's Central Highlands. He began his career as a union organizer, then became an investigative journalist. For decades, he did exactly the kind of journalism that in Ecuador can cost you your life. He investigated corruption in state contracts, the ties between organized crime and public officials, and the shady deals that enriched a few while the country sank. His best-known work was exposing the irregular contracts tied to Odebrecht, the Brazilian construction company whose bribery scandal splashed across a dozen Latin American countries. In Ecuador, Villavicencio named names, pointing to officials in the government of former President Rafael Correa. That made him the enemy of a lot of powerful people. For years, he received threats. He lived under armed escort. His daughters would later recall that growing up with a father in that situation meant living with fear as a permanent companion. Villavicencio knew it. He documented it, and he kept working. In 2023, he decided to take the leap from journalist to presidential candidate under the Constrai movement. His platform was anti-corruption, anti-establishment, direct. At his rallies, he denounced exactly the same things he had denounced as a journalist, the ties between political power and organized crime, but now from a campaign stage with microphones and cameras. Weeks before his assassination, it was public knowledge that he had received specific threats from criminal groups. The police had that information, his security team had it, Villavicencio had it. His lawyer stated afterward, "He was a man who knew he was in danger, but he also knew that if he stayed silent, the danger stayed the same." On August 9th, 2023, in the parking lot of the Coliseum in Quito, that danger became real. The investigation that followed was simultaneously successful and insufficient, and that combination is perhaps the most revealing thing about the entire case. In the hours after the assassination, Ecuadorian police detained 13 people, most of them Colombians linked to carrying out the crime. The gunman himself, the 18-year-old who fired the shots, had died at the scene. But what happened to the detainees hit Ecuador with a second wave of horror. Between October 6th and 7th, 2023, less than 2 months after Villavicencio's murder, 7 of the detained Colombian suspects were found dead in 2 Ecuadorian prisons, hanged, under circumstances the authorities never explained in a fully satisfactory way. The witnesses and defendants in the most high-profile crime of the year in Ecuador were eliminated while in state custody. The trial that followed, with the 5 suspects who survived to face it, began in June 2024. The prosecution laid out its case. Carlos Edwin Angelo Lara, alias El Invisible, leader of the criminal gang Los Lobos, had ordered the assassination from his cell in the Latacunga prison, using a cell phone. The logistical coordination, transportation, weapons, vehicles, even caps and t-shirts bearing the logo of Villavicencio's political movement so the hitman could blend into the crowd, had been organized by Laura Dayanara Castillo. On July 12, 2024, the tribunal handed down its verdict. Angelo and Castillo, guilty, 34 years and 8 months in prison each. The other 3 defendants, guilty as accomplices, 12 years in prison. Villavicencio's daughters released a statement. "We believe it is the least that justice could do for a man like our father, who gave his life for the country." But the July 2024 verdict answered only one question: who carried out the assassination? The question Ecuador hasn't been able to answer, and that prosecutors are still actively investigating, is who actually ordered it. Was it Los Lobos acting on their own? Was it someone who hired Los Lobos? And if it was someone who had so much power and so much interest in silencing Fernando Villavicencio, the leads that have emerged since 2024 point in a direction that Ecuador still hasn't been willing or able to fully confirm. A former police officer testified that he had spied on Villavicencio on the orders of Jose Serrano, former interior minister in Correa's government. An FBI video shown in later hearings captures one of the detained hitmen saying that the job was for a man up top, for Mr. Correa, referring to former President Rafael Correa, who lives in Belgium after being convicted of corruption in Ecuador and who was denied any involvement. In September 2025, an Ecuadorian judge ordered pretrial detention for former Correísta lawmaker Ronnie Aliaga and businessman Daniel Salcedo as alleged masterminds of the crime. Two other suspects, including Serrano himself, reside in Miami and are required to check in periodically at the Ecuadorian consulate. At the time of writing this script, the investigation into the masterminds behind the crime remains active. No one has been convicted of ordering the assassination. The case of Fernando Villavicencio is also the case of an Ecuador that transformed before the eyes of the world between 2020 and 2023. For decades, Ecuador was considered one of the most stable and secure countries in South America. It didn't have Colombia's history of violence, nor the crime rates of Venezuela or Central America. It was, in relative terms, a peaceful country. That Ecuador disappeared in just a few years. Homicides quadrupled between 2018 and 2022. Prison massacres, where bodies were dismembered and burned, became so normalized that the media stopped covering them with the same level of shock. Colombian and Mexican cartels found in Ecuador a convenient trafficking route and a state that had neither the resources nor the institutional capacity to resist them. Villavicencio's assassination was the moment when that collapse became impossible to ignore. A presidential candidate at a political rally in the country's capital 11 days before the elections. Ecuador declared a state of emergency. The government that took over afterward, headed by Daniel Noboa, declared war on 22 criminal groups and designated several of them as terrorist organizations. Fernando Villavicencio was 59 when he died. He had 3 daughters. He had spent decades doing the journalism that no one else wanted to do. In the country where that journalism could cost you your life, he knew it. He had it documented, and he kept going. The question Ecuador still can't answer is who made the decision that it was too much? Who made the call? Who set the price? Who signed off, in some sense, on the order that ended with Fernando Villavicencio in the parking lot of a coliseum in Quito one night in August 2023? That question remains open, and as long as it stays open, justice for this crime will be, in the words of his own family, incomplete. There's something more about the Fernando Villavicencio case that deserves specific attention. The state of the Ecuador that surrounded him at the moment of his death, because without that context, the crime seems inexplicable. In January 2024, 5 months after Villavicencio assassination, an armed group broke into the television station TC Television during a live broadcast. The footage went around the world. Hooded men with long guns shoving journalists to the floor, firing into the air inside the studio, all broadcast live. It was the same day that the leader of the Los Choneros cartel, known as Fito, had escaped from one of the most heavily guarded prisons in the country. Ecuador had stopped being a country in crisis. It had become a country at war. The transformation was fast and brutal. Between 2020 and 2023, the homicide rate went from 8 per 100,000 inhabitants to more than 46, the highest in South America. Ecuadorian ports, especially Guayaquil, became key transit points for cocaine bound for Europe and the United States. Colombian and Mexican cartels found in Ecuador a state that had neither the resources, nor the institutional capacity, nor the political will to resist them. And organized crime didn't limit itself to controlling the trafficking routes. It got into the prisons, into the municipalities, into the police forces, into the judicial system. What the Villavicencio case exposes, the possibility that political figures with connections inside the state were able to hire a criminal gang to eliminate a presidential candidate, is not an anomaly in that Ecuador. It is the logic of a system where political power and criminal power have become hard to tell apart. That's what makes Fernando Villavicencio's assassination something more than the crime against one person. It's a symptom, a sign of how far the penetration of organized crime can go into the institutions of a state that seemed to be functioning barely a decade earlier. Villavicencio's daughters have said publicly that their father knew the risk he was taking, that he had calculated it, that he had decided the cost of staying silent was greater than the cost of speaking. He chose to live according to his convictions, said his daughter Amanda, and he died for them. In a country where dozens of journalists and activists have been threatened or killed in recent years, that decision carries a weight that goes beyond individual courage. It's also a question for the system. How long can a democracy function when those who choose to speak end up paying that price? Ecuador still doesn't have an answer for that, and as long as the investigation into the masterminds behind the crime remains open, it won't have complete justice for Fernando Villavicencio either. In the previous case, we talked about a man who knew they were going to kill him and went ahead anyway. A journalist who documented his own danger and chose not to stay silent. Our next case also begins with a man who records a video before dying. But this case has a twist that makes it one of the most disturbing and complex in the recent history of Latin America. Because the video that Rodrigo Rosenberg recorded accused the president of Guatemala of ordering his assassination. And the UN investigation reached a conclusion that no one expected, that Rodrigo Rosenberg had hired his own killers. On May 10th, 2009, a Sunday morning, Rodrigo Rosenberg Marzano went out for a bike ride along Avenida de las Americas in Zone 14 of Guatemala City, one of the most affluent neighborhoods in the capital. He was 48. He was a corporate lawyer, a graduate of the best universities in Guatemala. He had children. He had a life built with care. A few minutes from his home, two hitmen on a motorcycle approached and shot him. He died on the spot. Hours later, at his funeral, someone played a video. The video was about 18 minutes long. Rosenberg had recorded it days earlier, in what was clearly a state of profound anguish. He looked directly into the camera and said, with the forced calm of someone who has processed something terrible, "If you are watching this message, it is because I was murdered by President Alvaro Colom, with the help of his private secretary Gustavo Alejos, his wife Sandra Torres de Colom, and Gregorio Valdez." He named the president of Guatemala, the first lady, government officials. He accused them of ordering his death, and he explained the motive. His clients, the businessman Khalil Musa and his daughter Marjorie, had been murdered weeks earlier, according to Rosenberg, because Musa was going to be appointed to the board of the state bank Ban Rural, and that threatened the system of corruption operating from inside the government. And he said that he himself would be next. The video went viral. Guatemala exploded. The impact was immediate and massive. Thousands of people took to the streets of Guatemala City demanding the resignation of President Colom. It was one of the moments of greatest political tension in Guatemala in decades. The government of the country's president accused of murder in a posthumous video recorded by the victim himself. The United States ambassador confirmed that the FBI had arrived in the country to help with the investigation. The International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, the CICIG, backed by the UN, took the case. Colom denied everything. He said the video was completely false. He called the accusation a political maneuver. For months, Guatemala lived with the unanswered question, had the president ordered the killing of his own lawyer? On January 12, 2010, 8 months after the assassination, the head of the CICIG, the Spanish prosecutor Carlos Castrasana, called a press conference. What he announced left the country speechless. The CICIG had analyzed more than 100,000 phone calls, it had tapped 14 phones, it had coordinated with investigators from 11 countries, and after all that work, it had reached a conclusion that no one in Guatemala had seriously considered. Rodrigo Rosenberg had planned his own assassination. According to the CICIG investigation, Rosenberg had contacted two cousins of his ex-wife, Jose Estuardo, and Francisco Jose Valdez Pais. and had asked them to hire hitmen to kill a man who, supposedly, was extorting him. The extortionist he gave them as the target was himself. The cousins, without knowing it, hired a group of hitmen, mostly ex-police officers and one former soldier, and paid around 350,000 quetzals for the job. The hitmen didn't know who their target really was. They only had a description, an address, and a schedule. On Sunday, May 10th, 2009, Rosenberg went out for a bike ride along the route they knew, and he was killed by men who never knew they were carrying out the plan of their own victim. The posthumous video recorded in advance, designed to be played at the funeral, was part of the plan. Rosenberg had constructed an elaborate narrative that pointed to the president and his inner circle. If the plan worked as he had designed it, his death would have triggered a political crisis that could potentially have destroyed Column's government. Why would he do something like that? The CICIG investigation didn't arrive at a definitive answer about Rosenberg's mental state in the months before his death. What it did establish was that he was deeply affected by the murder of his clients, especially Marjorie Musa, with whom he had a romantic connection that had begun after he divorced his wife. Some witnesses described a man who had lost hope, who believed the system would never punish those responsible for the Musa killings, and who was willing to do something extreme to force a crisis. Castrosana was careful at the press conference. He said the CICIG's conclusion was a provisional hypothesis based on circumstantial evidence. But he also said that evidence was overwhelming. The trial that followed convicted the direct perpetrators, the hitmen, with sentences ranging from 10 to 48 years in prison. The Valdez Pais cousins were convicted of complicity. The government of Alvaro Colom came out of the scandal without a formal conviction. The investigation into the murders of Khalil and Marjorie Musa, the original trigger for the entire story, followed its own judicial path, separate from the Rosenberg case. Castrosana emphasized on multiple occasions that the conclusion about Rosenberg did not close the investigations into the accusations he himself had made in the video, that if there was corruption at Ban Rural, that corruption remained the subject of an independent investigation, but for the general public, the story of the Rosenberg case was defined by the twist. The man in the video had hired his own killers. There's something about the Rodrigo Rosenberg case that still generates debate in Guatemala, and that deserves specific attention. Not everyone accepted the CICIG's conclusion. Rosenberg's defenders pointed to inconsistencies in the investigation. They questioned the chain of custody of the evidence. They noted that some key witnesses had been pressured or bribed to change their statements. A lawyer who publicly questioned the CICIG's conclusions was prosecuted for defamation and was later murdered in 2013 in a crime that also remains unsolved. Those contradictions don't necessarily invalidate the investigation's conclusions, but they do serve as a reminder of something important. Guatemala in 2009 was, and in many ways still is, a country where the truth is hard to establish definitively, where testimony can be manipulated, and where power has the ability to shape judicial outcomes. The CICIG itself was eventually expelled from Guatemala in 2019 by the government of President Jimmy Morales after the commission investigated him and his son for illegal campaign financing. The instrument that investigated the Rosenberg case no longer exists in Guatemala. Rodrigo Rosenberg was 48 when he died. He had children. He had a career built over decades, and at some point, in a moment of desperation, of rage, of conviction that the system would never deliver justice, he made a decision that involved people who didn't know what they were doing, left behind a video that pushed an entire government to the brink of crisis and died on an avenue in Guatemala City at the hands of hitmen he himself had hired without knowing they were his own. It's one of the most disturbing cases in Latin America, not because it involves exceptional violence, but because it raises questions about desperation, corruption, and the limits of a man who believed that the only way anything would change was to become the spark of a crisis he wouldn't be alive to see. Whether that was exactly what happened, or whether the truth is more complicated, Guatemala still doesn't know for certain, and perhaps it never will. To fully understand the Rosenberg case, you have to understand the Guatemala of 2009 and what it meant for a corporate lawyer to reach that point of desperation. Guatemala emerged from a 36-year civil war that ended in 1996. During those decades, the state had committed documented atrocities, including what the UN classified as genocide against indigenous Maya communities. When peace came, The institutions were destroyed, corruption was endemic, and the justice system was a fiction across much of the country. In that context, the CICIG was an unprecedented experiment, a UN-backed commission that operated within the Guatemalan judicial system, but with real independence to investigate powerful figures. It was the CICIG that investigated the Rosenberg case, and it was the CICIG that years later would investigate presidents, lawmakers, and businessmen until the system itself expelled it. Rosenberg knew that system. He had lived it from the inside. As a lawyer, he knew how corruption worked at Ban Rural because his own clients, the Musas, had been murdered for threatening that system. And he knew, with the experience of someone who had operated in that environment for decades, that the odds of those responsible for the Musa murders being brought to trial were low. That doesn't justify what he did, but it explains the logic of someone who believed that the only path for anything to change was a crisis of proportions large enough that the system couldn't ignore it. The darkest twist in the whole story, and the one that is most unsettling in hindsight, is that his plan almost worked. For months, Guatemala lived with the conviction that its president had ordered the killing of a lawyer. The protests were real. The political crisis was real. The pressure on Colom's government was genuine and sustained. If the CICIG hadn't had the technical capacity and the mandate to take the investigation as far as it did, analyzing 100,000 calls, tapping 14 phones, coordinating with 11 countries, the narrative of Rosenberg's posthumous video could have persisted indefinitely. In a country with less institutional capacity, with less international support, with a more corrupt prosecutor's office, the story of the Rosenberg case could have ended with the fall of President Colom, and with no one ever questioning whether the victim had orchestrated his own assassination. That, in itself, says something about the state of justice in Latin America, and about what desperation can drive a person to do when they don't trust institutions to deliver justice. The Rosenberg case is uncomfortable because it doesn't have a simple villain. It has a man in crisis who made a catastrophic decision. It has accomplices who didn't know they were accomplices. It has hitmen who didn't know who their real target was. It has a political system that was corrupt even if not necessarily guilty of this specific crime, and it has an international investigation that reached a conclusion many Guatemalans still don't fully accept. In 2019, President Jimmy Morales expelled the CICIG from Guatemala, the very instrument that had solved the Rosenberg case after the commission opened investigations into him and his family. The experiment in independent justice that had lasted 12 years came to an end. Today, Guatemala remains one of the countries with the highest judicial impunity in Latin America. The institutions that the CICIG helped strengthen over a decade are being systematically dismantled. Judges and prosecutors who worked on corruption cases have been prosecuted or exiled. The man in the video he recorded before dying wanted to prove that the Guatemalan system didn't work. The irony is that he was right, though for completely different reasons than the ones he laid out in that video. For years, a feeling circulated in Peru that was hard to explain but impossible to ignore. It wasn't just fear of crime, it was something deeper, more unsettling, the sense that there were people capable of doing anything and disappearing. People who didn't fear the police, borders, or the law. People who always seemed one step ahead. In North Lima, that fear had a name that almost no one dared to say out loud. An alias that appeared again and again in anonymous reports, in audio messages forwarded on WhatsApp, in messages that arrived at dawn from unknown numbers. El Monstruo. Okay, so I'm going to call him the Monster just because my Spanish sucks. His real name is Eric Luis Moreno Hernandez, and for years he was considered the most dangerous and most wanted criminal in the country. Not because of a single incident, not because of one specific crime, but because of something far more disturbing. The way he managed to build an empire of terror by combining violence, corruption, and impunity with the help of the digital world. The monster didn't need to be physically present to terrify. He didn't need to show up with a weapon or knock on a door. In North Lima, fear began in a much simpler way. A message on your phone, a short audio clip, a photo taken from the corner of your house. That was enough to understand that you were already marked. Eric Moreno was the leader of the criminal organization known as Los Injertos del Cono Norte, a gang dedicated to systematic extortion, contract killings, kidnappings, and territorial control. His business wasn't stealing, his business was fear, and the internet was his greatest ally. Drivers, shop owners, and small business owners lived under constant threats. The scheme was always the same: pay or you die. Pay or we burn down your business. Pay or someone you love disappears. And those threats were not made face to face. They were made through calls, through voice notes, through encrypted messages. The monster understood something before many others did. The cell phone is an extension of fear. He knew what time you left your house. He knew which bus you took. He knew where your children went to school. And all that information reached you through a screen. Cold, impersonal, impossible to argue with. According to prosecutorial investigations, at least 12 murders were directly linked to orders from Eric Moreno. 12 confirmed deaths. But those who truly understood how these gangs operated knew that number was probably only part of something much larger. Over time, his name became synonymous with terror. In North Lima, receiving a message associated with his alias meant one thing only: there was no escape. Many paid without reporting it. Others reported it and later regretted it. Some simply never lived to tell their story. The magnitude of the problem forced the Peruvian state to react. The Ministry of the Interior offered a historic reward, nearly 1 million sols, around $300,000 for information leading to his capture. It was a clear signal. The monster had become a national priority. But when the police began to close in, Moreno did what he did best: disappear. His escape was not improvised. It was planned, cold, and meticulous. He crossed borders through clandestine routes, avoided immigration controls, and left behind the country he had filled with fear. Bolivia was one of his first refugees. Then Brazil, then Paraguay, always on the move, always changing identities. Investigations revealed something disturbing. Moreno used fake passports bearing the real names of people from his own district. These were not randomly invented identities. They were carefully chosen to blend in. In the digital world, no one knew who he really was, and in real life, neither did anyone else. He also constantly changed phones, SIM cards, and email accounts. He avoided leaving traces. He deleted conversations. He discarded devices. For months, the internet was his hiding place. But not everything was luxury in his life as a fugitive. Far from North Lima, his power faded. He lived hidden in precarious rooms, sleeping on the floor, moving at night, avoiding routines. Even so, he was never alone. Every time the police got close, something happened. A message, a call, a warning that arrived before the operation. The monster didn't find out by chance. He found out because someone, somewhere, pressed send ahead of time. That invisible network of alerts and leaks allowed him to evade operations in more than one country. In Brazil, he was even linked to the death of a police officer, an accusation he would later deny. In Bolivia, he was close to being captured, and he was. In Santa Cruz de la Sierra, anti-drug agents managed to arrest him. The news spread across Peru in minutes. The most wanted criminal in the country had fallen, but the celebration was short-lived. 7 hours later, Eric Moreno was free. What happened during those 7 hours is one of the darkest episodes in this story. According to the testimony of his partner at the time, Bolivian police officers demanded money in exchange for letting him go. They moved him from one place to another while negotiating his freedom. There were no clear statements. There were no official records. But there were deleted calls, messages that were never saved, decisions made outside any formal system. The monster didn't escape by simply walking away. He escaped between turned-off screens and invisible conversations. The outrage was immediate. How was it possible that one of the most dangerous criminals in South America could be captured and released on the same day? No one gave clear explanations. No one took responsibility. And the monster kept running. After Bolivia, he understood that he had to be even more careful. He crossed into Paraguay, convinced he could disappear again. But this time, something changed. His support network was beginning to crack. In Peru, police had arrested relatives and close collaborators. The net was no longer just physical, it was digital, financial, and human. The final mistake was technological. Moreno reused a phone linked to an email account that was already under surveillance. A small slip, a minimal trace. For years, he had used the internet to hide. In the end, it was the internet that betrayed him. An anonymous tip did the rest. The location reached Paraguayan authorities, who decided to act differently. The operation in San Lorenzo was handled with absolute secrecy. Only a small group of high-ranking officials knew the exact information. They didn't even notify Peruvian police until the very last moment, fearing leaks. As evening fell, more than 50 agents surrounded the house. When they burst in, they found Eric Moreno calm, simply dressed, unaware that this time there would be no escape. He was subdued in seconds. Among his belongings, they found several carefully selected fake passports. As he was handcuffed, he asked a question that said it all. Who turned me in? Even then, he tried what he always did. He offered money. A lot of money, up to $1 million was mentioned, but this time it didn't work. No one accepted. His capture was a direct blow to transnational organized crime. The monster was transferred to a maximum security prison while extradition proceedings began. In Peru, the news was received with relief and with an uncomfortable question. How had he managed to escape so many times? Who helped him? Who looked the other way? The case opened a deep debate about the integrity of institutions. Lawmakers demanded that Moreno be interrogated before his extradition in order to identify possible accomplices within the state. The suspicion was clear. No one escapes that many times without inside help. Today, Eric Moreno awaits justice, but his story left an indelible mark. Because beyond the murders, the extortions, and the escapes, the monster exposed something far more disturbing. That true terror doesn't always come from a weapon. Sometimes it comes from a message, from a call, from a screen glowing in the middle of the night. Because in Peru, the darkest side of the internet isn't always on the deep web. Sometimes it's in the phone you carry in your pocket. It's 5 in the morning on December 16th, 2025. At the Olivos presidential residence, one of the most heavily guarded official homes in Argentina, a soldier is on duty. His name is Rodrigo. He's 21 years old. He's from the province of Misiones, in the northeast of the country. He's a grenadier. And that morning, at his post, Rodrigo takes his own life with his service rifle. Officially, it was a suicide, but there was more to it. A lot more. Because what investigators uncovered afterward is, honestly, one of the most disturbing things you're going to hear in a long time. Rodrigo didn't end up there on his own. He was pushed there, step by step, through messages, phone calls, and very carefully crafted lies. Rodrigo Andres Gomez was a voluntary soldier in the army. He was part of the Chacabuco squadron of the Grenadiers on Horseback Regiment, basically the elite unit responsible for guarding the presidential residence. Being a grenadier isn't something just anyone gets to do. It takes dedication, discipline, and a real sense of commitment. He was a young guy from a small province who had chosen to serve his country. His family talked about him with pride, and like any 21-year-old, he used his phone, downloaded apps. At some point, he wanted to connect with someone. That's all they needed to destroy him. It all starts with a dating app called Evermatch. Rodrigo signs up like anyone would. No red flags, no reason to think twice. A profile catches his eye. The name was Julieta Achelen Cardozo. Photos, a bio, everything. Just a regular girl, or so it seemed. Rodrigo starts messaging her. Things progress, back and forth. Nothing weird, nothing out of the ordinary. What Rodrigo didn't know was that there was no Julieta on the other side of that screen. There was an inmate, or several, operating from a cell inside the Magdalena prison in Buenos Aires, with a phone that, by all accounts, had no business being there. This was the first step in a trap they had already rehearsed, a trap they had set dozens, maybe hundreds of times before. Once the relationship had gone far enough, the real play began. Out of nowhere, Rodrigo gets a voice message, a woman, hysterical, furious. Investigators have a name for this moment, the terror audio. It's the point where the victim completely panics, and right then, right at that exact moment, the next character shows up. A cop. Well, someone claiming to be a cop. He introduced himself as an officer with the Buenos Aires City Police. He said he'd been informed about the complaint, that there was an open investigation, that Rodrigo was in serious trouble.
Buenos días, señor Gómez Rodrigo. Me presento, acá te habla Matías Navolconti, subteniente a cargo del Servicio de Investigaciones contra la Pedofilia Infantil Cibernética y Trata de Personas. Mirá, Gómez, en la oficina de enfrente tengo la madre de una menor de edad radicándome una denuncia en tu contra. Si me tomo la molestia de mandarte este audio porque te encuentro bastante complicado en la causa que se te está imputando. Tengo el dispositivo de la menor conectado a una PC, por lo cual se pudo haber recuperado todo tipo de fotos, archivos y conversaciones borradas de tu parte, lo cual te comprometen un montón. Te pido que te hagas una ventana horaria y te comuniques conmigo. Si no, de lo contrario, vamos a terminar de escribir la causa y mandarla directamente a la fiscalía que se encuentra de turno.
And then came the line that seals the trap, the one that genuinely turns your stomach when you hear it. The guy told him, word for word, "Your freedom is at stake and it's in my hands. Tell me how much you have right now in a digital wallet so we can make a transfer. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours." He wasn't a cop. He was Tomas Francavilla, an inmate at Magdalena, convicted of robbery, running his operation from his cell. Rodrigo paid. Of course he paid. By that point, with the psychological game in full swing, when someone tells you your freedom is on the line, that there's an investigation with your name on it, that you're a suspect in something that could ruin your entire life, you pay. He made several transfers to digital wallets. Think of these like Venmo or Cash App accounts, except they were registered under other people's names, women who acted as the operation's collectors. The total came out to around $1,000. For a 21-year-old volunteer soldier, that's an impossible amount to absorb. And the pressure didn't stop. They kept calling, kept demanding. The debt kept growing, or so they made him believe, and the threat of criminal charges hung over him like a sword. On December 15th, one day before he died, Rodrigo received several calls. At 5 in the afternoon, he had a 10-minute conversation with a number from La Plata, the capital of Buenos Aires province. Shortly after, he transferred the equivalent of about $200 more. That night, he reported for his shift. He wrote a letter, by hand, addressed to his family and his superiors. In it, he talked about financial trouble. He mentioned corrupt cops who were extorting him. He left it in the pocket of his uniform. And a few hours later at his post, Rodrigo Gomez shot himself with the rifle the Argentine army had given him. When they found the body, the immediate assumption was suicide, but things didn't add up. The letter, the messages on his phone, which had been locked away in a box, the activity in his bank accounts. The Federal Police's Homicide Division took the case. Federal Judge Sandra Arroyo Salgado led the investigation, and for over 50 days, they worked. Wiretaps, digital forensics, financial analysis, surveillance. What they found was an entire criminal operation, a gang with clearly defined roles, the ones who lured victims through the app, the ones who played the outraged mother, the ones who posed as cops, the women who collected the money. A smooth, efficient organization running out of a prison, made possible by something that sounds unbelievable but is completely real: the cell phones that inmates in Buenos Aires province prisons were allowed to use. When the government presented the results of the investigation, the chief of staff used a term that stuck: the crime SME. An SME, for those unfamiliar, is what most people would call a small or medium-sized business. And the comparison was spot on, because that's exactly what it was: a business, with structure, a division of roles, a pipeline for finding victims, steady income. And staff specialized in every stage of the con. And the most chilling part, one of the inmates, caught on a wiretap that ended up in the case file, was actually bragging about what he'd built. He said, "Search scammed by Noel Conti. I have more than one group with 100, 300 victims. All mine. I put every single one of them there." Rodrigo was just one name on that list, one of hundreds of victims, but he was the one who didn't make it out. The judge on the case made a point worth noting: this isn't new. There's a long history of serious crimes being committed from inside prisons through the use of cell phones. In Argentina, during the pandemic, phones were allowed into prisons through a collective court order, meant to let inmates stay in touch with their families. That measure was never fully reversed, and some people turned it into a business. Rodrigo's father, Juan Carlos Gomez, spoke out publicly. He said this could happen to any family, that what they did to his son was harassment that drove him to his death, and he urged other parents to talk to their kids about the dangers of this kind of scam. 7 people were arrested. 3 ringleaders were transferred to maximum security federal prisons. 4 women who received the money were also taken into custody. But Rodrigo doesn't come back. What happened to him has a name: sextortion, and it's growing across Latin America, across the world. It happens on dating apps, on social media, anywhere online where someone can build a fake identity and earn someone's trust. The trap is designed to make the victim feel like there's no way out, to make the shame and fear so overwhelming that they don't ask for help, don't tell anyone, and try to handle it alone. If you ever find yourself in a situation like this, or you know someone who is, there is a way out. The first step is telling someone you trust. Don't give in. Don't send money, because once you pay, the pressure doesn't stop. It only gets worse. Rodrigo Gomez was 21 years old. He was a grenadier. He guarded the home of Javier Milei, the president of Argentina. And he died alone at his post, because a group of inmates with a cell phone found the perfect way to make him believe he had no other choice. Valeria Marquez was a 23-year-old Mexican influencer. She uploaded makeup videos, beauty tips, and similar content on TikTok and Instagram. She had started gaining quite a following and slowly grabbing attention, not just for her content. She had won a beauty contest called Miss Rostro in 2021 and even had her own beauty salon in Zapopan, Jalisco. She also worked as a model and appeared in regional music videos. Everyone thought she had her life figured out, but suddenly, everything changed, drastically. On May 13th, 2025, Valeria was at her beauty salon doing a TikTok live, just like any other day. She was talking to her followers, showing a bit of her routine, everything normal, until a man walked into the salon pretending to be a delivery driver. He asked for her by name, and when they confirmed she was Valeria, the man didn't hesitate. He shot her in the chest and head. She died instantly, and obviously, her entire live stream audience saw what happened. The live ended quickly because one of the employees turned off the camera, but it was too late. Hundreds of people had witnessed the killing in real time. Authorities in Jalisco began investigating the case as a femicide, but right from the start, something didn't add up. Everything suggested it wasn't a robbery or a random attack. The strongest theory was that it was a hit, that someone ordered Valeria's murder. The man walked in casually, pretending to be a delivery guy. He asked for her, and once he confirmed it was her, he shot her without giving her a chance to move. Fast, direct, almost silent. That's typical cartel execution style. After the murder, heavy rumors began circulating. People claimed Valeria had ties with narcos. The name that came up the most was Ricardo Ruiz Velasco, better known as El Doble R, a major figure in the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, one of the most dangerous criminal groups in Mexico. To this day, authorities haven't confirmed anything, and Valeria's family denied she was involved in anything illegal. But the speculation didn't stop. People wanted answers, and the rumors became part of the case, to the point where even the media amplified it. Police also began closely examining the people who were with Valeria that day. One was her friend Vivian de la Torre, who had been with her right before the attack. Another was Erica, the employee who turned off the camera as soon as the shots were heard, supposedly to stop the live stream from continuing. Authorities believe one of them might know something or possibly even be involved in the killing, but so far there's nothing concrete. Everything remains full of doubts and theories. The most disturbing part of all this is not just the violence or the fact that it happens online. It's the normalization, the way horror disguises itself as opportunity, as work, as promise. In Mexico, the internet stopped being just a place to connect. It became a hunting ground, a fertile territory for exploitation, deception, and revenge. Today, a simple job ad can take you straight to hell. A TikTok live can capture your final moments, and a website can hide trafficking networks where human dignity means nothing. On May 14, 2025, a judge in Cucuta handed down a sentence. He ordered Maria Jose Estupiñán's ex to pay her 30 million Colombian pesos, about $7,000, as compensation for domestic violence. Maria Jose had been reporting that man since she was 16. She had activated protection protocols. She had asked the state for help, and that day, finally, justice had sided with her. The next morning, she stepped outside to receive a box of chocolates, and they killed her. Colombia, a country that between January and October of 2024 recorded 187 femicides reported in the media, 187 in 10 months, and in 129 of those cases, the attacker was the victim's partner or ex-partner. Maria Jose Estupiñán Sanchez was born in 2003 in Cúcuta, the capital of the Norte de Santander department, right on the border with Venezuela. She was a model, a digital entrepreneur, a third-year communication student at Universidad Francisco de Paula Santander. She had an online fashion business. She had thousands of followers on social media where she posted beauty, lifestyle, and fashion content. People knew her as La Mona. She was charismatic, a dreamer. Her friends described her as someone whose energy was just contagious. Weeks before her death, she'd gotten a nose job. She posted stories getting her hair done at the salon, driving her new car, going to the gym. She had a trip to Cartagena planned for May 15th. She never made it. To understand what happened to Maria Jose that morning, you have to understand what she'd lived through in the 7 years before it. At 16, she started a relationship with an older man, and from the very beginning, That relationship had violence in it. In 2018, when she was barely 16, she filed her first formal report for domestic violence. It wasn't her last. For years, Maria Jose activated what in Colombia is called La Ruta de Protección, the system designed to protect victims of gender-based violence. She filed reports. She requested protective measures. She followed every step the system told her to follow, and the system left her on her own. Alejandra Vera, director of the organization Mujer Denuncia y Muévete, said it straight to the cameras after the murder. She requested every form of assistance and protection to live a life free of violence. The Colombian state failed this young woman. On May 15th, 2025, at 8:12 in the morning, Maria Jose had just gotten back from the gym. She was at her house in the El Bosque neighborhood in Cúcuta, packing her bags for the trip to Cartagena. Outside, someone knocked on the door. It was a man dressed as a delivery worker. He was carrying a box of chocolates. The neighborhood security cameras caught every single second of what happened. You can see the man walk up to the front door. You can see Maria Jose open it. You can see the man say something to her while he holds the box. You can see Maria Jose reach out her hand to take it, and at that moment, the man pulled out a gun and shot her in the face. 6 shots. Maria Jose's mother was inside. She heard the gunshots. She came running out, and what she found when she opened that door is something no mother should ever have to see. Her scream, desperate, gut-wrenching, was recorded by the security cameras along with the video of the attack. That audio spread across all of Colombia and most of Latin America in the hours that followed. Millions of people heard it, and most of them couldn't make it to the end. The security camera footage went viral within hours, not because people wanted to see something horrible, but because Colombia needed to understand what had happened. Because 2 days earlier, on May 13th, 2025, Mexican influencer Valeria Marquez had been killed in an almost identical way. A man dressed as a delivery worker walked into her beauty salon while she was doing a TikTok live and shot her. Same method, same disguise, same gift as a pretext, different country, different victim, same logic. Use a woman's trust, her willingness to open the door, to accept something, as the trap. The fake delivery guy pattern wasn't new. It had already been documented in other countries across the region. But the fact that it happened twice in 2 days, to 2 women with a social media presence, made the conversation explode. Does being visible on the internet make women more vulnerable? Does having thousands of followers, sharing your everyday life, showing where you live and what your routines look like, does that make a woman an easier target for someone who wants to hurt her? The uncomfortable answer is yes. Digital visibility can be a double-edged sword. The same Instagram that gave Maria Jose a platform, an audience, and a business was also a source of information for whoever wanted her dead. Her routine, her address, her schedule, her face. Authorities opened the investigation under femicide protocol. The main suspect, though at the time this video was recorded he had not been formally charged, was her ex-partner, the same man she had reported when she was 16, the same one she had just won the compensation ruling against the day before her death. Colonel Leonardo Capacho, commander of the Cúcuta Metropolitan Police, confirmed that the main line of investigation pointed to the ex. This may be a suspected femicide because in previous years she filed reports for domestic violence. Maybe. In Colombia, that maybe carries a lot of weight. Because in a country where 129 out of 187 femicides in 10 months are committed by current or former partners, the statistics already answer the question. The hitman disguised as a delivery worker had not yet been publicly identified by the time this script was written. The investigation was still active. There's something about this case that goes beyond Maria Jose's individual murder. Even though Maria Jose's individual murder is already devastating enough on its own, it's the complete chain of failures. At 16, she filed a report. Not enough happened. At 22, she won a court ruling. The next day, they killed her. The system told her to file the reports. She filed them. The system told her to activate the protection protocol. She activated it. The system told her to trust the legal process. She trusted it. And the day the legal process finally sided with her, the day a judge said, "Yes, they hurt you. You deserve compensation," someone decided that couldn't be allowed to stand. Maria Jose Estupiñán was 22 years old. She had a business. She had thousands of followers. She had a trip to Cartagena planned. She had an entire life she had built in spite of the years of violence she had endured. And on the morning of May 15th, 2025, she opened her front door believing someone had brought her a gift. On March 10th, 2017, in Magdalena del Mar, Lima, Peru, 19-year-old Luis Sergio Ramirez Santos said goodbye to his mother as he did every day and headed off to university. At 6 p.m., his mother received a message from him, which she thought would be to let her know he was already on his way home or that he was going out with friends. But when she opened it, her eyes couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was a terrifying photo of Luis unconscious on the floor with several extremely serious injuries on his body and surrounded by a large pool of blood. All of this after meeting a girl he had met on Tinder. Luis Sergio Ramirez Santos was 19 years old. He lived with his mother and his younger brother in the Lima district of Magdalena del Mar. He was a calm, reserved young man, dedicated to his university studies and passionate about music. He was single, so like many people his age, he used Tinder to meet girls. He wasn't looking for anything serious. He was simply open to talking and experiencing something momentary with someone who caught his attention. That's where he met Ana Lucia Carranza Chiara, a 21-year-old young woman, also a university student, who lived an apparently normal life but had a rather introverted and reserved personality. On Tinder, she usually presented herself as approachable and friendly, although she could also be reckless when someone interested her. After exchanging messages for several days, they realized that there really was chemistry between them, so they agreed to meet for the first time at the Hoki Plaza shopping mall. They walked around, ate ice cream, and enjoyed their time together. At the end of the day, before saying goodbye, Ana asked Luis to walk her home in San Juan de Lurigancho. When they arrived, she asked him if he wanted to come in. He accepted, and as expected, they had an intimate encounter. After that, Luis got up, told her he had to leave, and said goodbye as if nothing had happened, assuming he would never see her again. He had been very clear. He wasn't looking for a serious relationship. He simply wanted something casual, something that directly signed his sentence. For Ana Lucia, that encounter was very special. She had fallen deeply in love with Luis after just one day together. For several months, she insisted, telling him she wanted to see him and that she wanted a serious relationship with him. But Luis refused. He had been very clear from the beginning. Ana felt rejected, but she still had a goal in mind, to make Luis hers. Luis began to ignore her. He didn't reply to her messages, turned down invitations, and told her he didn't have time to see her. And so it went on for an entire year with her being completely rejected by Luis. But because she was so persistent, he finally agreed to have a second date with her. 12 months of begging someone to be with you must be one of the worst humiliations you can put yourself through. What's strange is that during that time, Ana Lucia met another guy, also on Tinder, Anibal Augusto Chalco, and a relationship developed between them. Little by little, he became her confidant and emotional accomplice. He was the perfect guy, attentive, chivalrous, thoughtful, and completely in love with Ana, so he was capable of doing everything she asked of him. And when I say everything, it's not an exaggeration. He was literally capable of doing whatever it took to please her. On March 10, 2017, Luis arrived at Ana Lucia's house. For him, it was going to be an encounter like any other, spending some time together and then heading back to his home with his mother and brother. But he was completely wrong. Once he entered that house, he would never leave, or at least, not alive. When he walked through the door, Ana closed it behind him. She turned the music up to full volume and told him to follow her to the bedroom. Luis followed her. When he went in, he found Anibal standing in front of him, the current boyfriend of the girl he thought he was meeting. Luis didn't understand who he was, what he was doing there, or why he was holding a sword in his hands. Suddenly, and without a word, Anibal lunged at him and attacked him with the sword, severely cutting part of his right arm. The blow caught him off guard, and he fell to the floor as his arm began bleeding rapidly. At that moment, Ana Lucia began hitting and kicking him. She jumped on top of the poor young man, crushing his face, chest, and stomach, all while screaming at him and insulting him. Anibal, meanwhile, continued making cuts all over his body with a sword. It was an abhorrent scene, like something out of a gore horror movie. Luis could barely move. His breathing was shallow and his strength faded with every passing minute. She wouldn't stop screaming at him, telling him to apologize for all the damage he had done to her. But Luis didn't respond, not out of indifference, but because he was too badly injured, beaten, and had lost too much blood. He didn't even have the strength to apologize or ask her to stop. Ana took this as indifference, and with every second that passed without Luis apologizing, her hatred for him grew even more. The violence did not stop. They tied him up with ropes, beat him, and prolonged his suffering, as if the goal were not only to end his life, but to do it slowly. While Luis agonized, Anna collected the blood he was losing in plastic containers. She was completely insane. She watched it with a strange fascination, as if she were contemplating something beautiful in the middle of the horror. She watched how it slowly coagulated, and that simple process seemed to hypnotize her. Curiosity pushed her even further. She put her hand into the containers and began to play with the blood, enjoying the feeling of it between her fingers and smearing herself with it. Ana Lucia and Anibal were completely out of control, enjoying all the damage that they were inflicting on poor Luis. The sword cuts, the stomping, the blows, and the insults seemed more like entertainment mixed with rage than an act of revenge. Finally, in an act of absolute coldness, Ana Lucia sat on top of Luis's dying body, and while rubbing herself against him, she took a rope, placed it around his neck, and strangled him until she made sure he was no longer breathing. It was as if all of his suffering and death gave her pleasure. After ending his life, Ana Lucia and Anibal moved on to the next step of their plan. Getting rid of the body. They didn't improvise. They had been planning everything for days. They took out blankets, sacks, and ropes they had bought the night before. They began wrapping him carefully, layer by layer, as if they were trying to erase any trace of what had happened. The objective was clear: to make it look like just another bundle, an insignificant piece of trash. Hours later, they loaded the body into a taxi, transported it, and abandoned it on the 2,400 block of Constelacion Avenue in the center of San Juan de Lurigancho, in broad daylight, right in front of all the neighbors in the area without caring at all. The worst part is that Anna and Anibal were not finished. Before disposing of the body, they took photos of Luis lying on the floor, lifeless, surrounded by a pool of blood, and sent them directly to his mother's cell phone. The message came with a demand: 20,000 sols in exchange for her son's life, approximately $5,700. For the woman, opening those images was a nightmare, impossible to process. Seeing her son in that condition, when she thought he was calmly at university, worst of all, she still didn't know that he was already dead. They toyed with the desperate family's emotions, threatening them and making them believe that Luis's life could still be saved. The mother transferred 1,500 sols, about $400. It was all she had at that moment, and she thought it was the best way to try to calm them down and buy time to gather the remaining money to save her son. After receiving the transfer, Ana Lucia and Anibal went shopping at a mall as if nothing had happened, strolling around and showing the level of perversity and indifference they both had. But while they were enjoying the money, the police had already received the kidnapping report and a tip from neighbors on Constelacion Avenue about a strange bundle abandoned in the street. When police went to check it, they realized the full truth. It was Luis's body, with his hands and feet bound, wrapped in fabric and tape, his arms cut, his face destroyed, and signs of strangulation. By reviewing nearby security cameras and the taxi's route, they discovered everything. They saw Ana Lucia and Anibal leaving the body. They saw Luis entering Ana Lucia's house, but they never saw him leaving. When they searched Ana Lucia's house, they found everything else that sealed their fate: blankets, ropes, materials used to wrap the body, and clear traces that a crime had been committed. Ana Lucia and Anibal were immediately arrested and confessed everything in chilling detail, with a coldness that even frightened the police themselves. An atrocious, excessively bloody crime to have started with a Tinder date. After several trials in 2018, Ana Lucia and Anibal Chalco were sentenced to 25 years in prison. A few years later, Anna attempted to escape from prison and had to be transferred to a maximum security prison in Junin, where she remains to this day. In Argentina, the darkest side of things hides on the internet, and it was exactly there, in that corner most people would rather pretend doesn't exist, where a 12-year-old girl met who she thought was a new friend, a friend who, when they finally met in person, turned out to be something else entirely. Days later, she was found dead, hands tied, in an empty lot. That girl was Micaela Ortega, and this is her story. Micaela was 12 years old. She lived in Bahia Blanca, in the province of Buenos Aires, and she lived the kind of life most girls her age live: school, friends, endless texting. The internet was just part of her daily routine, like it is for pretty much every kid today. She was a normal girl from a humble family with a quiet, uneventful life, no drama, no enemies, no reason whatsoever to suspect that somewhere out there someone had already chosen her as his next victim, because that's the most disturbing part of all this. It didn't just happen. Someone planned it, carefully, patiently, with a level of cold-blooded calculation that's genuinely hard to wrap your head around. One day, like any other, Michaela got a friend request on Facebook from a girl named Rocio. She accepted without thinking much of it, and just like that, almost without realizing it, they started talking. At first, it was just small talk, the usual getting to know you stuff, but over time, it grew into something more. They shared things, told each other secrets, they talked every single day for hours. To Michaela, Rocio was a real friend, someone she genuinely connected with, or at least that's what she believed. What Michaela didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that there was no girl named Rocio on the other side of that screen. There was an adult man, a man who had created that profile with one single purpose in mind, and who had spent weeks, maybe months, building that friendship with one goal, and one goal only. On April 23rd, 2016, they made plans to meet in person. Rocio suggested they hang out in Bahia Blanca, run some errands, spend the afternoon together. Simple, normal, nothing suspicious about it. Michaela didn't hesitate for a second. Why would she? It was her friend. She knew her. Or at least, she thought she did. That day, she left home without telling anyone where she was going. It wasn't a big deal. She wasn't going far, wasn't doing anything dangerous. It was just an afternoon with a friend, right in the neighborhood. No reason to mention it to her mom. No reason to leave word of where she'd be. It felt like a completely ordinary thing to do. And from that moment on, nobody heard from Michaela again. When night came and her daughter still hadn't shown up, her mother, Monica Sid, started to worry. Michaela wasn't the type to stay out late without checking in. That just wasn't like her. Monica called her friends, asked around the neighborhood, and when she got nothing, she called the police. They started searching, checked the area, went door to door at nearby businesses. Nothing. It was like Michaela had just vanished. With nowhere else to turn, they looked through her social media, and that's where they found the first clue, the chat with Rocio. The conversations, the friendship built over weeks, and the specific plan to meet up that very day close to home. Armed with that, they pulled the security camera footage from the area near a roundabout on Bolivia Street. They went through it carefully, and there she was, Michaela, with her pink bag, walking calmly alongside an adult man. No Rocio anywhere, no girl at all. Just a man she clearly felt comfortable with, because she was walking right next to him, no hesitation, no alarm, like he was someone she trusted. Her mother looked at the footage and didn't recognize him. Nobody did, but there he was, and he was the only lead they had. What they did next was trace the IP address behind Rocio's Facebook profile. Every time someone logs into a social media account, they leave a digital footprint. And that footprint led investigators to a house in Ingeniero White, a small town just south of Bahia Blanca, a few miles from the city center. They went there, they raided the place, and they found Jonathan Luna. He was 26 years old. He had a criminal record. He'd been convicted in 2014 for aggravated robbery, but he'd never actually served that sentence. He'd fled and had been a fugitive ever since, until that moment, because from that day forward, Jonathan Luna wasn't going anywhere. But Michaela was still missing. 35 days had passed since the afternoon she walked out of her house with that pink bag. 35 days with no answers. Her family completely shattered, the entire country watching, and Jonathan, sitting across from investigators, saying he didn't know anything, that he hadn't done anything. Hours of interrogation, a lot of pressure. And then, finally, Jonathan talked. What he confessed that afternoon left everyone in that room speechless. And when it went public, it left the entire country speechless. He said he had created the Rocio profile himself. It wasn't spontaneous, it wasn't random, it was a decision. He had built it specifically to target young girls. He would find profiles of girls, start conversations, and patiently work his way into their trust. Michaela wasn't the first, but she would be the last. He found her on Facebook, started messaging her, and spent weeks doing the work, becoming her friend, learning what she liked, what she responded to, what made her open up. Every single thing was calculated, all of it leading toward one outcome. And when he felt like he had her, when Michaela fully trusted Rocio, he made his move and suggested they meet. That April 23rd, when Michaela showed up at the meeting spot, there was no girl waiting for her. There was Jonathan. He told her he was Rocio's cousin, that plans had changed, and that he'd take her to where Rocio was waiting. Michaela, with all the innocence of a 12-year-old, had no reason to question it. He was her friend's cousin. He was safe. The cameras caught them walking together. Michaela relaxed, completely unsuspecting. Jonathan beside her, slowly steering her away from the area, telling her they were almost there. Meanwhile, he was moving her further and further from anywhere with people, anywhere someone might see them or hear them. until they reached an empty lot on the outskirts of the city. No cameras, no neighbors, no one around, and that's where Jonathan Luna showed the world exactly who he was. He hit her in the head, Michaela dropped to the ground, and he got on top of her. What happened next is hard to talk about, not because there aren't words for it, but because it's almost impossible to accept that something like this could happen to a 12-year-old. But here's what needs to be said. Michaela fought. With everything she had, with every bit of strength in her body, she fought. She screamed. She struggled. She begged for help at the top of her lungs. But they were in the middle of nowhere. Nobody could hear her. And he was a 26-year-old grown man. Jonathan kept telling her to shut up, to stop moving, to stop fighting. Michaela wouldn't listen. She kept screaming, kept struggling, kept resisting, and that, in the mind of someone like him, is what pushed things over the edge. At some point, he snapped. He grabbed Michaela by the throat with both hands and started squeezing. She was still fighting, still trying to break free, but her strength was fading fast. He didn't let go. He kept squeezing and squeezing until Michaela couldn't fight anymore. That 12-year-old girl who had left her house that afternoon with her pink bag to go meet her friend died in that empty lot. When Jonathan realized what he'd done, he didn't panic. He didn't run. He tied Michaela's hands and feet, dragged her body into the brush, and covered it so it couldn't be seen. Then he walked away, just like that. And the only thing he said he regretted, the only thing, wasn't what he had done to that little girl. It was that he hadn't gotten what he came for. Between his confession, the security camera footage, the Facebook records, and the IP trace, the evidence was overwhelming. Jonathan Luna had nowhere to go. He was sentenced to life in prison for aggravated homicide, attempted sexual assault, and grooming. And that last charge matters, because it was the first time in the history of Argentina that grooming resulting in death was ever applied as a criminal charge. A legal milestone that completely changed how the country looked at these kinds of crimes. Michaela's name didn't just stay in the headlines as another victim. It got written into the law. Years after her death, Argentina passed the Ley Mica Ortega, the Mica Ortega Law, which created a national program to prevent grooming and educate kids, parents, and teachers about the dangers of online contact with strangers. An important law, a necessary law, a law that came because of her, but one that came way too late for her. Micaela Ortega was 12 years old. She walked out of her house one afternoon with a pink bag to go meet a friend, and she never came home, because someone on the other side of a screen had already decided she was his perfect victim. And the only thing that could have truly prevented any of this is if that man had never existed at all. October 31st, 2010, Bogota, Colombia. It's Halloween. La Zona Rosa, the club and bar district in northern Bogota, is packed. Thousands of young people in costumes celebrating. Just another night in a city that knows how to party. Luis Andres Colmenares was 20 years old. He was studying economics and industrial engineering at Universidad de los Andes, one of the most prestigious universities in the country. He was from Villanueva, La Guajira. He had come to Bogota to study. He was sharp, organized, analytical. That night he showed up to the club dressed as a devil. At 2:45 in the morning, someone saw him for the last time inside the party. He never came home. In the early hours of November 1st, 2010, Luis Andres Colmenares' body was found in Caño El Virrey, a water canal that runs through Parque El Virrey in northern Bogota, just a few blocks from where he had been celebrating. The police's initial take was simple: accident. Young guy at a Halloween party, probably drunk, fell into the canal. It happens. No reason to suspect anything else. His parents, Oneida Estupiñán and Alonso Colmenares, didn't buy it. From the very beginning, they felt something didn't add up, that the accounts from the friends who were with him that night didn't match, that the bruises on their son's body weren't consistent with an accidental fall, that there were too many details that just didn't fit. They went to the Fiscalía. They asked for the case to be reopened. They pushed, over and over again. And Colombia, which at that point wasn't paying much attention, still had no idea that the Colmenares case was about to become one of the most closely followed cases in the country's recent history. A year after Luis Andres' death, the Fiscalía reopened the investigation. A second autopsy revealed something the first one hadn't clearly established. Luis Andres had bruises on his body that were not consistent with falling into the canal. Some of those bruises could have happened before he entered the water. That changed everything. Investigators started taking a hard look at the people who were with Luis Andres that night, and especially two of them. Laura Moreno, who was in a romantic relationship with Luis Andres at the time, and Jesse Quintero, Laura's best friend. and Carlos Cardenas, Laura's ex-boyfriend, who was also in the area that night. What came to light during the investigation was a love triangle story full of jealousy and tension that Colombia followed in real time for years. Luis Andres and Laura Moreno had had a complicated relationship. In his notebook found during the investigation, Luis Andres had written something before heading out to the Halloween party that said everything about where his head was at that night. Like the good economics student he was, he had done a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats on whether or not to go to the party with Laura. Under the pros of going separately, he wrote, "Less pressure for both of us. Avoid comments about the relationship. More freedom." He was a 20-year-old kid navigating the awkwardness of being in the same place as his ex, and he was processing it using the methodology they taught him at college. That was the last thing he ever wrote in that notebook. The Fiscalia built a theory that there had been a fight that night, that Carlos Cardenas, Laura's ex, who supposedly still had feelings for her, confronted Luis Andres. That during that fight, Luis Andres received the bruises found on his body, and that Laura and Jesse, who witnessed what happened, lied to protect Carlos. Carlos Cardenas was detained in 2012, but his alibi, verified by his phone's geolocation, showed he wasn't at the scene when Colmenares disappeared. He was acquitted in 2014. Laura Moreno and Jesse Quintero were prosecuted for homicide and false testimony. The process was long, heavily covered by the media, and constantly interrupted by new revelations, contradictory testimonies, and side scandals. 3 witnesses were convicted of false testimony during the proceedings, which confirmed that someone had lied. But it never became clear who or exactly about what. In 2017, after 7 years of legal proceedings, Laura Moreno and Jesse Quintero were acquitted of the homicide charges due to lack of conclusive evidence. The Colmenares family did not accept the acquittal. They kept fighting. In 2024, the Supreme Court admitted a casación, a legal appeal that allows a ruling to be reviewed, against Laura and Jesse's acquittal. Colombia started talking about the case again, and in April 2026, 15 and a half years after Luis Andres' death, the Supreme Court of Justice confirmed the final acquittal of both women. It was not possible to prove that Moreno and Quintero were accomplices in a homicide, the court said. In fact, it has not been possible to conclusively establish that Colmenares' death was even a murder. 15 years, and the official answer is, we don't know. But there's something that makes the Colmenares case a specific part of this series about the internet. Because Colombia followed this case on social media in a way that had never happened before in the country. Starting in 2011, when Luis Andres' parents began pushing publicly, social media became the case's second courtroom. Facebook forums where anonymous users broke down every detail of the proceedings. WhatsApp groups where theories circulated, along with alternative accounts and testimonies from people who claimed to have seen something that night. Hashtags that trended every time there was a new development in the trial. The Colmenares family used social media deliberately to keep the case alive, to put pressure on the Fiscalia, to make sure Colombia didn't forget about Luis Andres. And it worked. For 15 years, every Halloween, the Colmenares case came back up in Colombia. But social media also did damage. Laura Moreno and Jesse Quintero were convicted by public opinion long before any judge said a word. Their photos, their profiles, their life stories circulated in forums where thousands of people, with no access to the full evidence, no legal background, no knowledge of all the facts, declared them guilty with a certainty that no court was ever able to uphold. Laura Moreno ended up disappearing from social media entirely. She got married in 2019 in Villa de Leyva, and photos from her wedding spread across Colombia as if they were evidence of something, as if the fact that she still had a life going on was somehow an offense. Jesse Quintero, according to reports, lives abroad. Nobody knows exactly where. 2 women who were acquitted by the justice system, living in hiding from public scrutiny 15 years after a Halloween night. What really happened to Luis Andres Colmenares? Nobody knows. Or at least, nobody who knows has told the whole truth. The possibilities are still the same ones as in 2011. Accident, he fell into the canal, drunk, in the darkness of the early morning. Fight, someone hit him and that contributed to his death or directly caused it. Cover up, there were witnesses who saw something and decided not to say it, which would explain the false testimony convictions. The Supreme Court said there wasn't enough evidence to convict anyone. But Alonso Colmenares, Luis Andres' father, still believes that someone knows the truth, that someone that night saw what happened, and that person decided, for whatever reason, not to talk. Luis Andres Colmenares was 20 years old. He studied at the most prestigious university in Colombia. He came to Bogota from La Guajira with an entire life ahead of him. He went to a Halloween party, and Colombia has spent 15 years not knowing how he died. Jorge Luis, known on the internet as El Compa Jorge, was a YouTuber from Culiacan, Sinaloa, 37 years old. His content had nothing to do with narco culture directly, nor did he seek to generate controversy as a growth strategy. He made videos about the modification and remodeling of off-road vehicles, specifically RZRs, those buggy-type vehicles designed for rough terrain, very popular in northern Mexico, among those who enjoy traversing rural and desert areas. He showed his routes through different parts of the country. He showed his vehicles, his modifications, his technical improvements. He showed photos of trips to the beach and the mountains. He had 65,300 subscribers on YouTube and almost 40,000 followers on Instagram, a solid community of people passionate about the automotive world, built with genuine content about something he really loved and that he mastered with real technical knowledge. But also occasionally he shared accounts about his personal life, his anecdotes, his experiences outside the world of cars. And one of those accounts, published on March 14th, 2021, would end up being the central piece of this whole story, without him being able to imagine at that moment the consequences it would have. The video was called Así conocí a un hijo de El Chapo. This is how I met a son of El Chapo, with numbers replacing some letters, a technique that content creators in Mexico deliberately use to prevent YouTube from identifying the content as controversial and demonetizing it or labeling it as sensitive. In the video, Jorge told a story that seemed almost anecdotal, the kind that anyone could share without thinking about the implications. He was between 19 and 20 years old when, at one of the arrancones, informal street races very popular in Culiacan, or simply cruising down the city's avenues showing off his car, he ran into a cousin who was traveling accompanied by another person. They talked about the sound system in his vehicle, a technical and specific subject that fascinates many young people in that region. The stranger showed genuine interest, almost enthusiasm. "Damn, your sound system sounds sick. What kind of equipment did you put in it? Because I have a BMW and I put 20 grand into it and it doesn't sound the same." Jorge didn't recognize the person at that moment. To him, it was simply another young car enthusiast, someone with whom he shared a common interest. The next day, his cousin called him. "Hey, compa, how did you like the kid I introduced you to yesterday? Real cool, awesome guy." Jorge replied, not suspecting anything out of the ordinary. "And you seriously don't know who he is?" "No, well, I don't know. That was Mr. Ivan Arquivaldo. He's El Chapo's son." And Jorge in the video described his reaction with a mix of surprise and pride that is disturbing in retrospect, knowing how this story would end. "Holy crap, well, what a pleasure to have met him." According to Jorge's account, he ran into Ivan Arquivaldo Guzman Salazar, son of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, and by that point, leader of the Los Chapitos faction of the Sinaloa cartel, on at least 3 more occasions over the following years. They even ended up exchanging phone numbers, although Jorge was clear in clarifying, both in the video and in later interviews cited by the press, that they were not close friends, nor did they maintain a frequent relationship. He described him as a very humble person. He recounted that in their first encounters they referred to each other as compa, an informal and close term, typical of northern Mexico, that suggests a horizontal relationship between equals. But he also pointed out something revealing about how the situation had changed over time. By 2021, when he published the video, he already had to refer to Ivan Arquivaldo as El Señor, Sir or the Boss, a change in address that reflected the rise in power of El Chapo's son within the cartel's structure, and the security restrictions that no longer allowed him to travel freely around Sinaloa in his luxury vehicles as he used to do in his younger years. In the last encounter that Jorge recounted in the video, he said that Ivan Arquivaldo recognized him immediately, got out of his Hummer truck, and came to greet him personally with a cordial and close manner. The video accumulated more than 200,000 views, a considerable success for a channel focused mainly on automotive content, which suddenly found a much wider audience interested in the morbid curiosity of narco culture. More than a year after the publication of that video, on April 18th, 2022, at around 1:45 in the afternoon, Jorge Luis was returning to his home in the Guadalupe Victoria neighborhood in Culiacan, after taking care of some everyday matters. 14 minutes earlier, he had posted a story on Instagram. It was a completely ordinary message, almost cheerful, the kind that any ordinary person would post without thinking twice. "What's up, my people? Happy start of the week to everyone. Vacation's over for those of us who got to have a vacation, and now it's time to get to work. Here I am about to go deal with the banks to see how long the line is. Blessings, folks. Beautiful day to all. It was the kind of post that any content creator makes 100 times a year, with no intention beyond keeping their audience connected to their daily routine, without any warning sign, without any hint that something was terribly wrong. As he got out of his vehicle and walked toward his house, 2 people approached and began shooting at him, without giving him time to react. He received at least 10 bullet impacts at close range in the thorax. The medical services arrived quickly and transferred him to a nearby clinic in the Las Vegas neighborhood. By the time he arrived, he no longer showed vital signs. The first speculations pointed to a robbery. Jorge had publicly announced minutes earlier that he was heading to the bank, which seemed to suggest that someone might have followed him with the intention of robbing him. But the number of shots and the precision of the attack made the police quickly rule out that initial hypothesis. 10 bullets at close range, concentrated in a vital area of the body, is not the typical pattern of a robbery gone wrong. It's the pattern of a planned execution. The Attorney General's Office of the State of Sinaloa revealed days later an additional and deeply disturbing detail. Jorge had already been lifted, briefly kidnapped in the local terminology, in a previous incident that he never formally reported to the authorities. After that episode, when he had decided to start carrying a weapon to defend himself, which gave him a criminal record for illegal possession that the authorities discovered during the investigation of his death. In other words, Jorge knew in some concrete and tangible way that he was in danger. Enough to start arming himself in secret, but not enough to stop posting his daily routine on social media, nor to leave Culiacan, nor to take far more drastic protective measures than the ones he ultimately took. For months, the question of whether the video about Ivan Arquivaldo had been the real motive for the murder remained without a conclusive official answer. The Sinaloa Attorney General's office only confirmed that Jorge had a criminal record for possession of the weapon, without publicly establishing a direct and proven link between the content of his videos and his death. But in May of 2023, more than a year after the murder, Borderland Beat, an outlet specializing in Mexican cartels, and recognized for its investigative work on organized crime in Mexico, published an extensive profile on Ivan Arquivaldo Guzman Salazar, based on deep journalistic investigation into his criminal trajectory and his rise within the structure of the Sinaloa cartel. In that profile, a list was included of executions allegedly ordered by Ivan Arquivaldo himself over the years. The name El Compa Jorge was on that list. The article did not detail the exact motives Ivan Arquivaldo would have had to order the execution of the YouTuber, leaving that question partially open. But the explicit mention of the video where Jorge recounted his encounters with him was presented as the most relevant and most likely context for understanding why a content creator with no apparent link to organized crime ended up on a list of that kind. There's something about the case of El Compa Jorge that's different from the other 2 cases we saw today, and that's worth pointing out clearly. Juan Luis Lagunas, El Pirata de Culiacan, directly insulted a kingpin knowing perfectly well that he was doing it, in a moment of absolute loss of control brought on by alcohol and the search for attention. Jorge Luis didn't insult anyone at any point. On the contrary, he described Ivan Arquivaldo with respect, almost with genuine admiration. He told the story from a place of sincere pride, like someone sharing an interesting and flattering anecdote with their community of followers. There was no provocation. There was no challenge. There was no attempt to gain notoriety by insulting or defying someone dangerous. And yet, according to the later journalistic investigation, he ended up on the same list as any declared enemy of the cartel, with the same final fate. That's what makes this case, in a certain sense, even more disturbing than El Pirata's, because it suggests that in the world surrounding Mexican organized crime, it's not even necessary to offend in order to become a target for elimination. Sometimes it's enough to know too much, to have been too close to someone powerful, to have publicly shared without any bad intention a detail that this powerful person prefers to keep private, even if that detail is something as innocuous and seemingly harmless as a casual comment about a car sound system. The YouTube channel of El Compa Jorge is still active today, like a testimony frozen in time. His last video, published 6 days before his death, showed the modifications he had made to his RZR. Nothing related to the cartel, nothing related to any kind of polemic or controversy, just a 37-year-old man speaking enthusiastically about something he was genuinely passionate about, with no idea that in less than a week, 2 hitmen would be waiting for him in front of his own house. That was Latin America. 10 cases, 10 countries, 10 different ways this region can be so brilliant, so alive, so contradictory, and so dark. If you made it this far, I truly thank you. This kind of content isn't easy to produce or to watch. If there's a country I haven't covered yet and you want me to cover it, drop it in the comments. See you in the next one.